Episode 73, winner of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, the Happiest Laureate, Bob Lefkowitz. Welcome to The Art of Excellence, a show about people doing extraordinary things in their lives. I'm your host, Glenn Zweig. Thanks for joining me. My guest today is Bob Lefkowitz. Bob is a Nobel Prize-winning scientist who is best known for showing how adrenaline works via stimulation of specific receptors. He was trained at Columbia, NIH, and Harvard before joining the faculty at Duke University and becoming an investigator of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. In addition to being a researcher, Bob is a cardiologist as well as a cardiac patient. His book is titled A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Stockholm: The Adrenaline-Fueled Adventures of an Accidental Scientist. Bob, welcome to the show.
My pleasure to be here.
What do I actually call you, Bob, or I think they used to call you Lefkowitz, like back in the days.
Lefkowitz or Lefty, but you can call me anything you want except Robert. And the reason for that is that the only person in my life who ever called me Robert was my mother when I was a youngster. And she did that only if I was misbehaving, as in, Robert, get in here.
Yeah, I didn't have a nickname, but if my mom threw in the middle name, that's when you knew you were in trouble. If you heard the middle name, you just run for the hills. So Bob, you were, if you don't mind my saying, a card-carrying nerd growing up. So did math and science come really easy to you, or did you have to work really hard because you wanted to get good at it?
I think the math and science, one, came easy to me. Mm-hmm. And two, one of the reasons it came easy to me is for whatever reason, I loved it. And you know how it is. If you love something, it just seems to come more easily.
Yeah, well, you used to feign illness so you could stay home and read. And I've got to admit, this is a first. So I've heard of kids playing hooky to watch TV, to play video games, or read in terms of reading comic books. But I'm assuming you're talking like actual books with nothing but words in them. So that's somewhat unusual, wouldn't you say?
I think it is. I didn't realize it at the time. I was an only child. And my parents, encouraged me to read a lot. A lot of value was placed on reading. But I was actually very mischievous. Part of it, as you said, was that I would feign illness to stay home. The other was that, I don't know if they have this these days, but in the New York Times book review section, when I was, say, 10 years old, they used to have coupons that you could clip to join book clubs. One was called Literary Guild, another was Book of the Month. And the idea was if you joined the club, you could choose one or another set of books free in return for guaranteeing, essentially signing a contract that you would purchase 3 or 4 more books in the course of the year. So without telling my parents, I would clip the coupons, send them in, choose sets of books, obligating them to buy several additional ones. And I still vividly remember, and this is when I'm 10 or 12 years old, 2 sets that I obtained in this way. One was Winston Churchill's 6-volume history of the Second World War. The other was Sandberg's 5-volume biography of Lincoln. By the time I was probably bar mitzvah age, 13 or 14, I had read both sets.
So you're taking off from school to stay home to read a 6-volume set of Winston Churchill.
That's correct. that is correct.
Well, there's the future Nobel Laureate speaking, I guess. I don't want to get so heavy so quickly, but Bob, your father had a pretty bad heart condition, and he had his first heart attack when you were still just a kid.
Right. And
that wouldn't be the last one. Was that some of the inspiration behind your wanting to go into cardiology and coronary related research down the road? Because, you wouldn't be able to save your dad, of course, but maybe you could save others.
Absolutely. There is no doubt about that in my mind. I think that my conviction that I wanted to be a physician came very early. and antedated my father's manifestation of heart disease. But my choice of a specialty as cardiology was without a doubt motivated by what I saw in my home and my father's 4 heart attacks. And I can tell you from personal experience with many, many colleagues that the family history of illness is often a dominant feature in determining the specialty that a physician goes into. Very, very common.
Right. Well, the specialty for sure, but how about the fact that you even knew you wanted to go into medicine at, I think, the age of 8?
What was behind that was one particular individual by the name of Dr. Joseph Feibusch. He was my family physician. He was an internist and a family physician. He made house calls in the Bronx, and I was totally taken with this man. He was this guy who knew special stuff that the rest of us didn't know, who could come into your house, lay on hands, carry this black bag with all manner of magical things in it, a hammer to tap your reflexes, a stethoscope, even had medications in there. It was all just unbelievable. And he would endlessly answer all my questions. And so by age 8, I was quite convinced that there was no other course for me in my life but to be like Dr. Feibusch. And of course, what I was experiencing was a calling. Of course, I didn't realize it as such. We normally associate the idea of a calling with clergy, but you can feel a calling to anything. And I felt a calling to medicine. It was just this sense, this is my destiny. I have to be like this guy.
Well, you definitely seem like you're in a real hurry to grow up. I mean, you graduated high school at the age of 16. You finished college in 3 years. You started med school at 19. And by then, I think you already were married. And then on the way to having children or somewhere right around there. Why the rush, Bob?
I was married at 20 and a father at 21. And would go on to have 5 children with my first wife. It's a very good question as to why I was in such a hurry. I don't really know. Part of it is I was in a hurry to be a physician because, I've been dreaming of that all my life. But as to why I was so driven throughout my entire life, I don't know. I think that's just something that's hardwired. They talk about a type A personality and type B personality, where the type A is always in a hurry to get there, etc. So I don't really understand that. I think, it's just one of the aspects of my personality. It's hardwired. Someday we'll understand way in the future what the whole set of genes is that determines that kind of behavior. But to this day, I find that in myself. For example, I can't deal with having unanswered emails in my inbox. I've got to deal with them now. And the fact that we're talking right now and I'm not looking at my email and they are, building up at some low level is saying, geez, I gotta get to this. I'm in a hurry. So I think it's just hardwired.
You and me both, by the way.
Okay.
I have to deactivate the email before I do these interviews, or I'll be distracted the whole time.
I'm saying, and as with many, let's call them neurotic personality traits, not a neurosis, neurotic personality traits. They have adaptive and maladaptive features, right? I mean, part of my success, and I suspect part of yours, is being a type A personality. On the other hand, some of the anxiety that comes with it and some of the other negative features, that's just all part of the bargain.
So there was a really interesting story how you almost lost your son. And if it weren't for your medical training, he probably would have died. Can you tell that story?
Yes. So I was a first-year medical resident at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. And my wife, Arna, and I had 2 children. Actually, we had 3 children, now that I recall. David was 4. I was working a terribly difficult schedule. Like every other night, I was on duty, etc. We lived in Yonkers, New York. And David, for a couple of days, had what seemed like just a typical run-of-the-mill viral upper respiratory infection, such as kids that age get. But one morning, I got up and I was rushing to get down to the hospital. And I went to say goodbye to him. I didn't like the way he looked. His breathing seemed a little labored to me. At some instinctive level that only a physician, I think, really can pick up on. It just didn't feel right. And so, amazingly, I did something I had never done before or since. I didn't go to work. I called in and I said, look, I can't come down. Somebody needs to cover for me for a few hours. I need to sit and watch my son. I'm just not comfortable with how he's doing. Within an hour, he started to really deteriorate. His breathing got more labored, and I could see a touch of cyanosis in his lips and fingertips. And I said, this is bad. So I said to my wife, get your mother to come down here to watch the kids. We're going to the hospital. And we called the pediatrician who was at Albert Einstein Medical Center and told him what was going on. He said, come right down. Off we went. I was driving a very high rate of speed, and he continued to deteriorate and was gasping for breath. By the time we arrived, we went racing in with him in my arms. We went right to the doctor's office. The nurse tried to stop us. She said, the doctor's with a patient. I said, I don't care. We're going in there. I suspected that he had a condition called epiglottitis. The epiglottis is a lid that sits over the airway, the trachea, so that when you swallow food, it goes backward and it covers your trachea so you don't aspirate. When you're not eating, it's in an up position so that you can breathe. In epiglottitis, it becomes so swollen that it completely obstructs the airway, the trachea, and you can't breathe. And it's lethal if an airway is not established. Well, the doctor, based on the history I had given, as soon as we came in, he put him down on a table, stuck a tongue depressor in his mouth, took one look, and I was looking over his shoulder, and you could just see this huge epiglottis. So the diagnosis was secure. He immediately paged a stat emergency, and he said, we're going to the OR. They had me sign a consent form for a tracheotomy. The pediatric anesthesiologist arrived. He said, I'm going to give one try to pass a nasotracheal tube. That means to stick an airway down through the nose and with tremendous skill to sneak it past this very swollen epiglottis into the airway. He said, if that fails, which it probably will, we'll do a tracheotomy. And amazingly, this guy was so skilled that that one try worked. The trach was not necessary. He got the airway in place. He was hospitalized for 4 days, but made a complete recovery. And ever since, I've often wondered about, why did I stay home? I mean, the kids had respiratory infections a million times before, but there was just something about the way he looked which bothered me. And I'll always be thankful that I had the medical training that enabled me to pick that up, because I really do think he would have died otherwise.
Wow. Yeah, I don't even know how to think about what forces, in the universe caused you to have had the training to be able to triage something that was life and death like that.
And also, if, my schedule was that I was away from home 36 hours at a time. So that happened to be the morning after I had slept at home. If it had been a day earlier or later, I wouldn't have even been there that morning. I would have been sleeping at the hospital. So you talk about fate. Many things came together to save his life that morning.
So at one point in the depths of the Vietnam War, to avoid getting shipped off, you got accepted. Very, very few people did, but you were one of the lucky few to get accepted to the NIH to do research for 2 years, which would fulfill your military obligations. But Bob, working in a research lab didn't exactly come naturally to you, to say the least, which is, I guess, somewhat ironic to hear from a future chemistry Nobel laureate. But why did you struggle with it so much?
Well, I think there were several reasons. Much as I had always wanted to be a physician, and much as I loved science, I was a chemistry major. For whatever reason, I never had any interest in actually doing original research myself. I loved reading about it, but I just didn't have any interest in doing research. The impetus to going to the NIH was more wanting not to support the Vietnam War and get shipped over there than it was to have a wonderful research experience. But okay, I figured I'd make the best of it. And I wanted to be an academic physician by then anyway, and having some research credentials seemed like a good idea. But I experienced something during the first of my 2 years at the NIH that I had never really experienced in any significant way in my life to that point: failure. I had never really failed, much less in a sustained way, at anything. In fact, I was not, as you said, I was kind of a nerdish kid, but I loved sports, but I had absolutely no athletic talent. But by dint of hard work and practice, I made myself, in the sports that I liked, like stickball and softball and swimming, I made myself into a a more than adequate athlete. So even at things where I was not blessed with any real talent, I could more than get by dint of hard work. But here, no matter how much effort I put, I couldn't get the experiments to go in the direction that I wanted. And I had never dealt with that before. And then right in the middle of that, 6 months into the experience, my father literally dropped dead after his fourth heart attack, which put me into a bit of a, I would say, in retrospect, clinical depression. So the combination of previously unexperienced sustained failure and my father's death, and I was an only child, very close to my dad, two things really put me into a tailspin and convinced me that when my 2 years were over, I needed to get out of there because I really didn't want to do research.
Well, you would, of course, go on to finish up the 2 years there, got back into practicing medicine, got somewhat settled in, but it didn't take that long before you started to grow bored with it and started longing to do the research again. And it seemed like, if I'm summarizing this correctly, the cautious approach of following standard operating procedures, operating protocols in medicine, was in stark contrast to the creativity and experimentation that's needed in research, which is sort of interesting to hear because that creativity and experimentation is exactly what caused you to struggle, if you will, and fail for the first time, as opposed to medicine where you sort of learn your procedures, the routines, and then you can sort of do it, you rinse and repeat, right, with your eyes closed. So help me understand this, because why was failure such a fuel as opposed to something that closed off a path for you?
I mean, you really hit the nail on the head. It was at the Massachusetts General Hospital, which is where I went for further clinical training after the NIH, where I, again, threw myself into clinical medicine, which I loved. And I would say that I wouldn't describe it as getting bored with the medicine, because I love the excitement of it. It's a totally different kind of experience. And I loved helping people, all the motivations that had driven me to medicine in the first place. But at some deep level, something was missing. That's what I sensed. Something is missing. And when I realized, you hit it. I think if you have creative urges, I found that in the practice of medicine, they weren't being met. And you really nailed it. I couldn't have said it better myself. There are two almost opposite ethoses, or whatever the correct plural is, in medicine, practice of medicine and research. In medicine, your goal is to do it like everybody else, to follow the standard operating procedure, follow the standards of care, etc. And in fact, if you do that, you are completely protected from a malpractice suit if you do it according to the way it's supposed to be done. In research, if you do it the way anybody else did it, that's called confirming somebody else's data, and you get no credit for that. You have to do it like nobody ever did it before. And I think it was that desire, which I didn't really fully understand at the time, that desire to do things either a little better or take a step that nobody had taken before. It's almost addictive. And I think that's the dope that you start taking. I need to do something that nobody ever did before, to figure out something that nobody ever figured out before. And I think that's what began to really motivate.
Well, once you decided that you're all in on research, you ended up with this incredible gig at Duke. You got your own lab with all the bells and whistles. And of course, you would eventually go on to win the Nobel for the discovery of what's known as the G protein-coupled receptors, GPCRs. Many basic physiological processes depend on these receptors. About half of all medications act through those receptors, beta blockers, antihistamines, and a number of others. And so, Bob, thanks to the work you did, you and of course your colleagues in the lab, we can now relieve hypertension, coronary disease, and many, many other conditions. So this is obviously a very, very big deal with huge, broad implications for medicine, for society. But it has been 37 years since my chemistry class in high school. So here's my favorite. Bob, give me the For Dummies version of what a G protein coupled receptor is. You can even, let's say, start with what the heck a receptor is and why it matters, and let's just sort of build up from there to understand the true gravity of what you did here.
So drugs, hormones, neurotransmitters, like we all hear about, like serotonin or dopamine or adrenaline, work on cells. But before our work, nobody really knew how they work. And there had been talk in pharmacological circles for perhaps 100 years that there might be such things as receptors, meaning things, not knowing what things was, things on cells that hormones and drugs might kind of bind to or stick to initiate their actions on cells. But there was really no evidence to prove that these things existed or to know anything about them.
So just to pause there.
Yeah.
And just to sort of translate as we go along here, be sure I'm understanding it. So let's use an example, adrenaline, that everyone's familiar with.
Right.
I'm taking a nice hike in the woods and suddenly a bear comes across my path. And so adrenaline is going to be secreted and I'm going to end up with my heart's going to be racing, my blood pressure is going to increase, my eyes are probably going to dilate. And I'm going to run like heck, right? Fight or flight response. So we know that adrenaline is a hormone that's secreted, and we know what ends up happening in our cells to cause these reactions, but we didn't understand how the adrenaline would actually connect to the cells to enable these changes. Is that the sort of...
You're right on the money. As I like to say, I couldn't have said it better myself. So I was convinced, more as an act of faith than by any evidence that existed, that there must be specific molecules on the cells which represented receptors. That is, specific sites on the cells to which the adrenaline would fit into, much like a key fits into a lock. And in that analogy, the receptor is the lock and adrenaline is the key. And the idea would be, just as a key fits into a lock because of its exact complementarity in structure between the ridges on the key and the ridges on the lock, that there must be a complementarity in structure between this receptor molecule that I was postulating existed and the adrenaline. And so I began to try to first prove this assertion, and then, assuming I would be able to prove it, to try to figure out what these receptor molecules were. But there were no technologies available to do any of that. So I sort of had to invent the techniques as I went. So first of all, I had to find some way of tracking the receptors. And I did this by labeling things like adrenaline or beta blockers. Now, let me just explain what we mean by a blocker or an antagonist. So there are really two types of drug, let's say, or hormone, which could fit into this lock, which is the receptor. One we call an agonist, and the other we call an antagonist or a blocker. An agonist is something like adrenaline. It actually stimulates something. Mm-hmm. Histamine, serotonin, dopamine, they're all agonists. So an agonist you might picture as a key that fits into the lock and can turn it and then make something happen in the cell. An antagonist or a blocker, like a beta blocker, would be something which fits into the lock, but then sort of picture, supposing that the end of it breaks off. So now it's stuck in there. It can't turn, it doesn't do anything, but now the adrenaline can't get in there. It's blocked because it's sitting on that receptor, but not doing anything. So those are the two types of molecules. So I began by sort of using radioactive labels to tag molecules like adrenaline to see if I could stick them to these putative receptors so I could follow them. And after much trial and error, I was successful. I showed that the binding sites that I had identified had all the characteristics that you would expect of a receptor. And then over a period of years, I studied their properties, how they worked, etc. Ultimately, I was able to use the techniques of protein biochemistry to isolate these receptors and clone their genes and figure out what their structure was like. And then to discover that the receptors for all manner of substances, as I mentioned before, in addition to adrenaline, things like dopamine, serotonin, histamine, were all receptors which had the similar molecular structures. They were members of what we call a gene family. And then one of the most seminal discoveries we made, which came in 1986, when we cloned the gene for the beta adrenergic receptor, which is a particular receptor for adrenaline, which I had been studying for 15 or 20 years. When we cloned the gene, we were able to see that its structure looked remarkably like the structure of another molecule, and that molecule was rhodopsin. Rhodopsin is essentially, if you will, a receptor in the retina, which is stimulated by photons of light. Nobody had ever analogized this molecule rhodopsin to any other kind of receptor. But when we saw that its structure was so similar to the beta receptor, it occurred to me that, wow, maybe many, many receptors look just like this. And so very quickly, we were able to get the structure of about 8 or 10 more of the receptors in this family. And sure enough, they all looked alike. And so we realized that all of these receptors were part of the same family. Meanwhile, it had been discovered by others that these receptors all work through a common mechanism, which is that they activate a signaling protein in the membranes of cells called G proteins. And then over the next few years, others, not my lab, were able to show, based on our work, that not only did drugs and hormones work through this type of receptor, but we see through such a receptor. Then it turns out that our ability to taste, same thing, taste receptors, part of the same family. We smell through these receptors. And it turned out that there are 1,000 different types of these receptors encoded in the human genome. Well, over the last 30 years, it's turned out that these receptors are what's called very druggable. It's possible to create drugs which, like keys, fit into these different locks. And as you said, today, anywhere from a third to a half of all FDA-approved drugs in the United States are drugs which target these receptors. That's about 700 drugs.
Because you're saying if we don't have intimate details on the lock, all the way down through the gene sequencing of the lock, then we can't very well develop a key that's going to fit into it.
Exactly. And although some drugs had been developed prior to all this information, it was very laborious. And, we didn't have a lot of drugs and they weren't all that good. Because of the new molecular information and the techniques that we developed for studying the receptors, now it's much easier to develop these drugs, and we can develop much more specific drugs.
So, but let me just stop you there. This was started. This is back like in the 70s, where
early 70s, late 60s, yeah.
So what prompted you to devote your lab's efforts, and for that matter, your life's efforts, to this field of research? Did you sort of look ahead and say, I understand there's a lock. I got to find the lock. I got to dissect the lock because then we can make these keys. And then, decades from now, all of medicines will work through. Like, did you have that vision, or is it more like, this is a fascinating area, cell research and everything, and I just want to dive in and see what I learned? Like, what was behind, the guiding light, if you will, if there was one?
In science, nobody comes with anything out of the blue. Everybody builds on what went before. For me, the remarkably fortunate experience was that I had two wonderful mentors at the NIH, one named Jesse Roth, one named Ira Paston. They're both in their late 80s now, and remarkably, they're both still doing their thing. And they believed in the idea that there were receptors, even though it was not a particularly popular notion at the time. And they kind of inculcated that idea in my head. They weren't particularly interested in adrenaline, but they had me work on a project in their labs trying to find receptors for a hormone called ACTH. And I had some success with that project, didn't take it that far, but it got far enough to convince me that there really was such a thing as a receptor. And at that point, it really did become a vision for me that, look, these things have to exist. And if we could but understand them, know what their structures were all about, it would open up a world of possibilities. I had no idea, to be quite frank, what that world of possibilities would be. And I would further point out something about the nature of fundamental or basic biomedical research, especially one carried out by physician scientists. So throughout my work, it was never my intention to cure a disease, create a drug, or anything else. I was driven by raw curiosity to understand a particular biological phenomenon and to understand these receptors. But as so often the case with fundamental research, the long-term clinical and therapeutic implications have turned out to be beyond anything I could have imagined. And I think often with the Nobel Prizes, and I think this is one of the reasons it often takes so long to get a Nobel Prize. I mean, my work goes on to this day, but I think the most seminal work I ever did was in the 80s and 90s. And I think that was what was being recognized by the prize. It often takes 25 or 30 years because to get that prize, because it's only in the fullness of time that one can appreciate what all the ramifications are. And that was certainly true here.
Hey there, listeners. So I want to give a quick shout out to a podcast I've recently subscribed to called the Pausecast. That's Pausecast with a Z. The host is Adam Posner, who's the founder of NHP Talent Group, which does executive recruiting for startups and brands. He's had successful entrepreneurs on the show, business executives, the former New York governor, and many, many others, with the theme of how they've harnessed tenacity to drive their success and how you can do the same with your own careers. What I also enjoy about the show is listening to leaders in HR and recruiting, so you're able to have an insider's view as to what they look for in finding and developing talent. So whether you're looking to get inspired or figure out a career blueprint, you'll definitely get something out of this podcast. You can find the show at thepausecast.com or wherever you subscribe to your favorite podcasts. Okay, now back to the show. Well, while you were experiencing this enormous success professionally, things weren't going as smoothly in your personal life. The long hours in the lab would take a heavy toll on your marriage and would eventually lead to a divorce. Not only had your father passed away, but you inherited some of that and you developed a really bad heart condition, which would require an invasive and risky quadruple bypass surgery. And this is back in the day when it was a lot more dangerous, certainly, than it is these days with modern techniques. So it seems like this became a time of deep introspection for you. Did you learn anything about yourself during that period?
Yeah, I did. And it was a time of deep introspection. This would have been in the divorce in the late 80s and then the surgery. I learned that I was a lot more vulnerable than I might have believed earlier. I think, there's a certain, I like to use the Yiddish term, chutzpah of youth. Again, both adaptive and maladaptive features of that chutzpah. I think that chutzpah enabled me to do things that in the laboratory that I'd be frankly afraid to take on today. But that chutzpah allowed me to do those things. But during that period, and this would have been in my 40s, midlife, I realized I was vulnerable. And I guess the first sort of intimations of mortality, etc. Because of my father's early demise, he was only 63. My mother lived to the ripe old age of 89, but she also had premature coronary artery disease. So I felt I was a marked man. We talked earlier about why I was in such a hurry. And I don't know, I hadn't really thought about it much. To be totally honest, throughout my 20s and 30s, I had two deep-seated feelings about my life. One was that I would die young because it had happened to my father and I so closely associated with him. The other was that I would accomplish something of significance. I didn't know of what significance, but I really felt that I would do something meaningful in my life. And those two things together may, in part, have explained why I was in such a hurry, because I felt it was my destiny to do something that mattered, but it was also my destiny to die young. So I better get on with it. Now, did I ever conceptualize it and articulate it to myself in such a clear way? No, I don't think so. But during that time, that very difficult time with the divorce, which again I saw as a failure on my part, and then having to have this very invasive surgery, I just felt terribly, terribly vulnerable. And I didn't really know whether I'd be able to come back from it. But I did, thank God.
Yeah. Well, on a lighter note, after whatever it was, 25, 30 years of work, the day finally arrives when you get that long-awaited call that you will be receiving the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. It is obviously the biggest honor one can ever receive in the sciences. So I'm sort of curious, when you hung up the phone after getting the news, were you just ecstatic, like jumping up and down like a kid? Or was it just a huge sense of relief, that after so many years, finally feeling like your life's work had been recognized at the highest levels?
Well, that again is just a wonderful and perceptive question. I'm curious, did you ever see a movie? It was popular a couple of years ago called The Wife.
I don't think so.
It's a movie in which a literature professor wins the Nobel Prize in literature. The movie begins with him getting the call from Stockholm. And as soon as he hangs up, he and the wife jump up in the bed and they're dancing around, singing and yelling, etc. That is not the way I experienced it. It was more the second way that you mentioned. I had been touted to win the prize for many years, possibly as many as 20, during which time people would wait every year to hear, did Bob win? Did Bob win? And Bob didn't win. Then on two separate occasions, the Nobel Prize was given, once in the 90s and once in the early 2000s, to other scientists whose work was in areas distinct from mine, but close enough that I easily could have shared the prize. And so it was almost like, well, Bob is being passed over, etc. So it became almost like a monkey on my back. And so when I got off the phone, having received this call, what I really experienced was more, as you said, a quiet sense of satisfaction and vindication that this long wait is over. And on a more humorous note, but it's true, I remember one of the thoughts that went through my mind was, never again in my life am I ever going to have to answer the question, Bob, when are you going to win the Nobel Prize?
Right.
A question I have been asked many times.
Yeah, I'm sure a question you love to hear for so many years. What's interesting is when you went to Stockholm to receive it, I didn't realize how much just pomp and circumstance there was behind this. It's like the Oscars. But the press described you as the happiest laureate. What's behind that moniker?
I think, they did all sorts of interviews with us. We were on TV stations. We were on the front page of the newspaper. And, you can't really appreciate your own personality. For example, I think you've probably had this. I mean, the one thing everybody agrees on when they hear their own recorded voice is, that's not me. That doesn't sound like, it's not what I sound like. I'm sure you must know this.
I've gotten used to it now, but I still don't like it.
So I can't know what my personality is like, but from what people tell me, I'm kind of effervescent. I'm very passionate about anything that I talk about, just because that's me. And I think that came through. Some scientists are kind of dour. I mean, for example, and I don't mean this in any negative kind of way, you could not have two more divergent personalities than myself and my former trainee, Brian Kobilka, now a distinguished professor at Stanford, who shared the prize with me. We're polar opposites. I'm kind of an extrovert. I love interacting with people. I'm generally very upbeat about whatever is going on. And I think that came through to the press. And then they started calling me the happiest laureate. And I was proud to have the title. What's not, as my mother would say, what's not to be happy about?
Right.
You just won the Nobel Prize.
Well, again, this is after decades of work. So I want to talk about, you can use the term grit or tenacity, resilience, whatever one you like, because research is mostly failure. It's failed experiment after failed experiment after failed experiment, and years and years and years on end. So what keeps you motivated through all of these endless setbacks? Like, how do you stay positive and hungry with all that energy and enthusiasm you need to keep plowing ahead?
Failure is your constant companion if you're going to be a research scientist. And it's one of the hardest things for young scientists to learn. And part of my job as a mentor is to help guide them through that. In that sense, my sustained failure through the first 12, even 15 months at the NIH has stood me in good standing because I know what it is like to fail. I remember talking with a senior scientist while I was in the depths of my despair at the NIH, and him trying to comfort me. And he said, "Bob, do you know what percentage of the experiments of an average scientist actually work?" I said, "No." He said, "It's about 1%. He said, "Now, what do you think for a world beater, the top scientist, a Nobel laureate, what percentage of his experiments do you think work?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "It could be as high as 2%. And that really stuck with me. The idea that even for the best scientists, probably 98% or more is failure. So you have to learn to accept that, but you have to also learn to set not just long range goals, but very, very short term goals. So in other words, I find if you break a problem down to minimal little steps and then say, okay, I can take that step. I can develop this little assay, forget the long range thing. And then once you make that, the next and the next and the next, and you just sort of keep going. But again, part of it too is personality. You know, it's a matter of developing certain calluses and always sort of keeping an upbeat and an optimistic outlook. I actually give a talk to the fellows at Duke once every year or two called How to Deal with Failure and Rejection in Science. And the main thing I try to show them all the failure that I've had. Because, you know, people tend to think somebody who's been outwardly successful, like me, is that, oh, this guy Lefkowitz, everything he touches turns to gold in the lab. And of course, nothing could be further than the truth. 99% of what I do is failure. So I particularly delight in sharing with them copies of rejection letters and reviews that I've gotten for some of my scientific papers, where other peer reviewing scientists take me apart, you know, basically call me all sorts of names, and et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, you have to develop those calluses. And I think it's important for young people to see that some of the people they look up to as sort of their biggest scientific heroes are facing the same kind of failure they are day in, day out. It's just that what you see in the journals is the stuff that worked, not the stuff that didn't work.
Well, even though you won the Nobel, and you and your colleague, that is, you know, research is really a team sport. And over the years, many of your mentees would go on to have illustrious careers themselves, running their own labs, winning their own accolades. So clearly, you weren't just a gifted scientist, you were a pretty gifted leader as well. And I want to talk about a few of the leadership principles you brought up. And I want to start with hiring, because you had this unique hiring practice that you like to recruit the brightest and most scientific minds you could find and just sort of let them find their way, as opposed to hiring for specific expertise or techniques. Tell me more about that.
Yeah. So I have colleagues who, you know, will have a specific need for a technique in their laboratory at a particular point. And so they'll go out looking for somebody who has that technique. I've never followed that. And what I'm looking for are, as you said, the brightest, most creative people that I can find. Techniques you can always learn or find somebody to teach you how to do it. And also techniques are short-lived. Many scientists make the mistake of thinking, okay, so some scientist has developed some fabulous new way of doing things. And so people beat a path to his door to learn the technique, thinking they can build a career on that technique. And if they do that, they will quickly learn that they're going to have a short career, because within 10 or X years, that technique is going to be replaced by some other better technique. So you have to learn to build your research edifice on problems, important problems. And that being the case, I want the people who have been the most creative and the ones who I can best sort of try to teach how to find the best problems. And I also like a particular outlook. So a question I often surprise my people when they're interviewing with me to a job for a job as either a student or a postdoc. Somewhere during the interview, I'll ask them, so tell me, do you consider yourself lucky? And that often takes them aback. And I get all sorts of answers, ranging all the way from, well, not really. Things are kind of tough for me. And, it often rains on my parade, but, I try to muster through. And then you have other people who will say at the other end of the spectrum, well, as a matter of fact, I guess I am kind of lucky. Things kind of work out for me. And I often feel that, fate is on my side, etc. So who do you think I hire? Of course, the ones who think they're lucky, because a lot of luck is a self-fulfilling prophecy. In general, if you think you're lucky, you're probably lucky. Yeah. And if you think you're not lucky, you're probably right.
You mentioned another one is be enthusiastic.
Yes.
Be excited, but not just overall, but what each person individually is working on. Be like their biggest cheerleader.
Exactly. I think that's very, very important. A lot of mentoring is really empowering people. I'll give you a couple of examples. Almost 20 years ago, when I was turning 60, Duke had a big Festschrift 2-day thing in my honor. And we had about 100 of my former trainees back. And one of the things, they were giving talks about their own science, but they were also telling stories about what they remembered being in my lab. And one guy, Rick Serione, who now holds a distinguished chair at Cornell, told the story that when he was in my lab in the early 80s, that I kept him at this fever pitch of excitement about his project. And he explained that the reason was that every time he talked to me, he came away convinced that his project was, at least in the boss's mind, the single most exciting project in the laboratory. But then one day he was talking to one of his, lab mates and sort of saying that. And the lab mate said, well, wait a minute. He said, I have the distinct impression that my project is, in Bob's view, the most exciting one. So then he started talking to some of the other people, and it turned out everybody in the lab had the same impression, that their project was Bob's favorite amongst everything that was going on. And of course, the reality is they were all right, every one of them, because in my mind, in the moment I was talking to them about their project, it was the most exciting thing in the lab, and I really believed it, and they sensed that enthusiasm. So I think that's one part of empowerment. I think another way that you can empower trainees, and this is probably the single toughest part of mentoring, and I think there's really no right answer to this. And it has to do with the fact that you have to treat every mentee differently. There's no one size fits all. But the key question that you have to decide with every trainee is, how much am I going to guide them? How much am I going to tell them exactly what I think the next step is, as opposed to giving them room to figure that out themselves? You can err at the extremes in either direction. You can be totally standoff and just sort of let them, sort of jump in the water and learn to swim. But then often they're going to flounder. And in any case, what's the sense to coming to you for mentoring? I mean, they might as well not be there if you're not going to guide them. On the other hand, I know I have colleagues who treat their trainees almost like technicians and try to literally guide them each and every day as to exactly what has to be done. Now, the problem with that is, while you may get to the end result more quickly, the trainee never gains the confidence that they actually, when you ultimately meet with success, they don't have the confidence of being able to say, hey, I did this. I really did this. And if they don't have this confidence, if they leave the lab with the feeling that, well, I was very successful, but, in the back of their head as well, but, could I really have done it without Bob? That's not good.
Well, not just that, but it's also because they're probably coming for some of the same reasons you originally did, which is they're on a path toward creativity and experimentation and freedom and risk-taking. And if you get too directive, too prescriptive, it takes away some of the ingenuity and some of the fun, frankly. So
exactly right. And it leaves them, and here's to me the key thing, they need to have intellectual ownership at the end, okay? They need to feel they were a major part of the ultimate success, because from that intellectual ownership comes the confidence when they leave my laboratory to say, hey, I did it before, I can do it again. As opposed to, well, golly, I don't know if I can do this without Bob. So I think that's just a very key part of mentoring.
Yeah. One last one I want to touch upon, and this one, no surprise, coming from the Happiest Laureate, but to laugh and have fun. So help me understand why humor is important in a laboratory environment.
I find, and again, I said before, and I'll assert it again, there's no one right way to do science or anything else. But for me, humor is a very important part of life and of any activity I'm involved in. I think it's particularly important myself in doing science. Now, true, a lot of scientists don't have the greatest sense of humor. But to be honest with you, most of the scientists that I know, especially the very successful ones, have very robust senses of humor. And in my lab meetings in particular, I use humor a lot. I find that humor gets the creative juices flowing, if you will. And so I try in my lab meetings to do that. I don't tell jokes, by the way. And once in a while I do. But for the most part, what I do is just point out the humor in everyday circumstances. Humor is basically a very, very creative enterprise. When you point out that something is funny or tell a funny story or even a joke, there's a key moment when the person listening to you appreciates the humor. We might say, gets the joke. Mm-hmm. And in that moment, when they get the joke, they're making a discovery, a tiny little discovery. They're seeing a relationship between a couple of elements that all of a sudden they see in a different way. And that's why it's funny, because they hadn't seen it that way before. And that's a discovery. So for me, being funny and being scientifically creative really go hand in hand. And I find at my lab meetings, the more I get people laughing, the more creative ideas just seem to flow.
Yeah. Well, like you said, it could take years and years, decades, till one truly understands the implications of what they've done. So you might as well have fun.
Exactly. And when people are having fun, they tend to work better, to do better. If you're a dookie, so you must follow the basketball team, and from time to time, any top team will lose a game to a much lower ranked opponent. And so now it's after the game, and they're interviewing the players, the Duke players, whatever, and saying, "What happened out there? Why? How did you guys lose to these?" She says, "I don't know. It just wasn't working. We just weren't having fun tonight." That's right. They weren't having fun tonight. And when you're having fun, it's loosey-goosey. The ball's going. Every shot is going in the net. Yes, having fun is to me a very positive thing.
So, Bob, I always conclude with this question. It's a simple question, not always a simple answer, but the name of the podcast is The Art of Excellence. When you think of that word excellence, what does it mean to you?
There's a quote that I once read. It was from John F. Kennedy. He said something like, "True happiness is the full use of your powers along lines of excellence." The full use of your powers along lines of excellence. And to me, that's what it's all about. At some point in your life, marshaling whatever your powers are to the fullest extent, to do things that are of some inherent value, social value, some value, then I really think that you can really feel good about your life and feel that you have achieved success in whatever realm you've tried to.
Fantastic answer. Bob, this is such a pleasure. The work you've done, whether that Nobel came or not, it is just incredible what you have enabled with your life's work. Thank you so much for taking the time with me, with my audience, and sharing your story. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed this interview a great deal.
Hey, thanks for listening. Okay, don't go yet, please. 2 favors. I ask simply 2 favors. One, if you could please download the iTunes app. You could do it on your phone. You could do it on the computer. Take 60 seconds and leave a review. It means a lot. 2, you can find my episodes on several social media sites, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. Find the one that you like the most. Find the one where you tend to have a lot of friends and followers. And if you could please either share it in the case of Facebook and LinkedIn, or retweet it on Twitter, that would mean the world to me. So those are the 2 asks I have. I love putting together this podcast. I hope you enjoy listening to it. Thank you so much, and I will see you again next time. Bye-bye.